Welcome to the Powerlifting and Power Ballads podcast, where we bring you a weekly dose of powerlifting news, tips, and training advice with a touch of 80s rock ballads. This podcast is presented by Team Roar Powerlifting, your source of the most comprehensive coaching and meet day preparation. Here are your hosts, Josh Rohr and Laura Sturm.
All right, welcome back to our presidential candidate interview series. We are here with Joe Warpeha. Joe, how you doing?
Doing good, Josh. Thanks for having me.
Good deal. So we'll jump right to it. We'll kind of start just who are you? What inspired you to run for USA president, and what unique qualifications or experiences make you the best candidate for the job?
All right. My name is Joe Warpeha. I've been a member of USA Powerlifting since 1999. Most people watching this would probably know me for my current role as the technical committee chair, a position that I've held since 2018. In my day job, I'm a college professor. I teach in an undergraduate and a graduate exercise physiology program. I'm just finishing up my 17th year at my college. I was first inspired to run for president when a long-time and well-respected member suggested back in 2015 that I consider it because he thought I'd be a good fit for the position. It was just kind of a random conversation we had, took some different twists and turns, and started talking about the presidential election that was happening that year. That was a presidential election year. And he said he thought I'd be a good candidate. I thanked him for the compliment and told him I wasn't nearly ready at that time, but that planted a seed. And that seed has grown since then. And that's where we're at today, 10 years later. So that's really, there's a pretty specific origin story to where this inspiration first came from. In terms of areas that I think are important in terms of qualifications and experiences to consider when deciding on the next president, I'll go through those three areas. I'll also explain how I believe I have those qualifications and experiences. So number one is leadership experience. I'm not quite sure how someone without any leadership experience could be an effective president of a 30,000 member organization. My leadership experience really comes in two different areas. Number one, my day job. So in addition to being a faculty member and teaching classes, I'm also the department chair of the exercise physiology department, and I'm the program director for our bachelor's and master's programs. So I believe I've gained valuable leadership experience in my day job role at the college. But within USA Powerlifting specifically, I've held several different positions over the years. Number one was state chair. So I was a state chair of Minnesota for 10 years. I wrapped up my last term in 2019. I did not run for re-election after that. In the course of those 10 years, the membership in Minnesota went from 58 members the year before I took over to 796 in my last year. And we went from 2 annual meets in the state to 17 meets in my last year. So we experienced significant growth during that time. During my tenure as state chair, I was the sole state chair. Nowadays, it's pretty common for states to have co-chairs or even 3 chairs. Back then, it was more common for states to have just 1 chair, and I was the state chair for those 10 years. So that's number one. Number two, I was the RAW committee chair for 8 years until the committee dissolved in 2018 because there's really no longer a need for it. That's a committee that a lot of newer members have never heard of because it's been 7 years since we had the RAW committee. But there was a lot going on in those early years of RAW lifting. USA Powerlifting introduced it in 2008, and shortly thereafter, there was seen a need for a committee. So I got on that committee and then became its chair a couple of years in. Did that for 8 years. Technical committee chair is the role I currently serve in. I'm 6.5 years into that. I've been serving in that role since 2018. In that role, I largely, my committee largely oversees the rule book, anything related to the technical rules, referees, referee exams. We're an extremely busy committee. I put in anywhere from 10 to 20 hours a week on that committee these days. So it does keep me pretty busy. There's a lot going on. When you talk about the rules, it really affects every single member. So stay busy with that one. And then finally, the executive committee, I was a member for 6 years, 2 terms, from 2012 to 2018. I then stepped away from that committee and then ran again this following this past September, and am now 9 months into my what would be second stint on the EC, but third term. So that wraps up my what I would consider my leadership experience in USA Powerlifting. I think number two, having an understanding of not only the history of our organization, but the larger sport, as well as the broader culture of strength training is important, I think, in our next president. I've been a member since 1999, so that's 26 years. In reality, I've really only been paying attention to what's been going on in the organization probably for the past 16 years. That's when I first became state chair. Prior to that, my initial 10 years in the organization was as a lifter primarily, and then I did become a referee in 2006. But I would say once I became a state chair, I really started paying attention to what was going on in the organization, really getting an understanding of the people and the events that make up the history of our organization. I think that's really important to any president coming in at any time, but I think it's particularly important now when we've had a massive turnover in essentially every level of leadership over the past several years. There's been a pretty big turnover in state chairs over the past several years. I think back to NGB meetings of years ago, and you'd look out in the audience, and it was pretty much the same faces out there representing the same states, and there'd be a turnover here and there, but for the most part, it was the same group every year. And now I look out at the audience in the NGB, and it's a lot of relatively new faces over a pretty short period of time. We've had turnover in various committee chairs, and this last fall with the elections, I think we had probably what was the most significant turnover in terms of numbers of executive committee members, at least as long as I've been in the organization. We also have a new executive director as of January. So truly, there's been a significant turnover at every level of leadership in the organization. And I think it's particularly important that whoever's going to come in as the president has a deep understanding of the history, the people, and the events. These things aren't, typically written down anywhere to go, look up to know who did what when and what were the results of that. So I think the fact that, for the past 16 years, I've been paying pretty close attention to that history and really developing an institutional memory, I think would serve me well in the role of president. As it relates to the deeper history of the sport, so beyond USA Powerlifting and looking at powerlifting, the sport in general, that's been a personal area of interest of mine in recent years. And if you look at my letter of intent that I submitted, as well as my resume, there's a link to the article that I wrote in 2015. Interestingly, that started as just a brief history of the sport for some of the original versions of the coaching course for USA Powerlifting. I was asked to do a little bit of a write-up, and it started very briefly and then just grew into a monstrous project for me out of personal interest. And I discovered that really nobody, as far as I could tell, had ever really written down the long, deep history of the sport of powerlifting. And so it was of personal interest to me. I felt like it needed to be written down. It was also a place that I could go and access information that I needed. So that article's out there. You can certainly go look at that. But I do have a great appreciation for the sport of powerlifting and its history, where we came from. And then finally, I think the broader culture of strength training. I started lifting weights in high school as a sophomore. That was in 1992. So I'm now 33 years into my strength training experience. I haven't competed in powerlifting in several years. The injuries started adding up, but strength training will always be a part of my life. And I think it's important to have an understanding of the broader culture of strength training, because certainly powerlifting, occupies a place in that world. So that rounds out just kind of an understanding of the history of the organization, the sport, and some of the reasons why I think that's important for the incoming president, as well as, ways that I think I have experiences in those areas. And then finally, number three, I don't think, leadership is important, understanding the history is important, but if you have the wrong personality qualities, it's all for nothing. So I think personality qualities very much matter in a president. Things that I strive for, and I think people would characterize me as, if asked to describe me, I try very hard to be objective, fair. I try to be non-reactionary. Being pragmatic is important to me. I do consider myself a very strategic-minded person, always trying to think about the next 2 or 3 moves ahead and whatever that may be. It's important to me to be ethical, honest. I am a very detail-oriented person. I try to be even-keeled. I mean, many of you who know me have probably only seen, one emotion. You don't see a lot of extremes either way. But I think being even-keeled is important for particularly the role of the president. I do try to be diplomatic in all my interactions. It's not always easy, but I think it's important. And I do find a lot of value in being measured in my responses. I think that's important. People that have worked with me on committees, so I've chaired a couple committees in the past. I think they would describe me as a consensus builder. I really try and listen to all the thoughts, all the opinions, take it all into account when deciding on a particular course of action. I am also, always willing to change my mind or my opinions on something when given new information. I do think that's important, considering the sorts of things that are going to land on the president's desk. And then finally, I firmly believe in the idea of 2 ears in one mouth. I do think that's important. So that probably rounds out the answers to your first question, Josh.
Yeah, I think that covers it.
Okay.
That's good. Yep. All right. So moving on to question number 2. Can you briefly explain and speak to Brother Bennett's philosophy on drug-free powerlifting and how you feel that fits in today's powerlifting world?
I think it fits in today's powerlifting world much the same as it did in 1981 when Brother Bennett led the group that founded the ADFPA, our predecessor. So I think a little bit of a look back at a brief history of what led to that. So I'll try and keep it brief. If you want the more detailed history, it's in that article that I referenced earlier. But, if we go back to the beginning of maybe, let's say, drug use in sport, performance-enhancing drugs, anabolic steroids, whatever you want to call them, testosterone was first isolated and synthesized in the laboratory in 1935. By the mid-1950s, I think historians unanimously agree that anabolic steroids had infiltrated the sport of Olympic weightlifting, famously at the 1954 World Championships, if I remember correctly. And it wasn't, long after that they spread to bodybuilding and powerlifting. I think it's probably safe to assume that anabolic steroids were a part of our sport of powerlifting from the very beginning. And if you look back to the origins of powerlifting as a sport, it really was formalized in 1965. That's when the first official senior national championships took place in York, Pennsylvania. So in those early years, it was AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union, that oversaw powerlifting, and they also oversaw a lot of other sports. Come 1978, there were some various things that happened that broke up AAU's monopoly over all those sports, and each sport had to have their own independent governing body. And that's where we see the formation of the first truly powerlifting specific federation in the United States, and that was the United States Powerlifting Federation, USPF. They were formed in 1978. They were the IPF affiliate until 1997 when we replaced them, the IPF having their origin in 1972. Come 1981, it was the founding of American Drug-Free Powerlifting Association, ADFPA, USA Powerlifting's predecessor. They had a very specific drug-free and pro-drug testing mission. And then following that, a couple of years later, the APF, American Powerlifting Federation, was formed in 1983. And they had a very different philosophy, and their philosophy was very specifically, they were against drug testing. So that's just kind of a little bit of the background, leading up to the formation of USA Powerlifting. And I would like to read a quote from Brother Bennett. So I've got it on a sheet of paper here. So this quote comes from the May-June 2004 journal called Iron Game History. The title of the article was "Chaos Can Have Gentle Beginnings: The Early History of the Quest for Drug Testing in American Powerlifting, 1964 to 1984. The article was written by Dr. Jan Todd from the University of Texas, Austin. So it's a relatively short quote, but in November of 1981, at a meeting in Arlington, Virginia, Bennett and a group of like-minded friends adopted bylaws, elected an executive committee, drafted an oath that all members would have to sign, and set up testing policies for the American Drug-Free Powerlifting Association. Several months later, at the tumultuous 1982 USPF Women's Committee meeting in Auburn, Bennett spoke eloquently about the group's goals and urged the women lifters to join him. So, direct quote from Brother Bennett, "What we do reflects who we are." He goes on to tell the group, "Drugs offend the concept of fairness. Athletic competitions are becoming more and more chemical competitions. Does this sound right? Moral? Ethical? If we are to have respect for others, we must first have respect for ourselves. A different world cannot be made by indifferent people." So, end quote. And that's, the origin of USA Powerlifting in the words of our founder, Brother Bennett. So fast forward to today, and it's a very different powerlifting landscape. In those earliest days, there were, in the United States at least, there were three distinctly different powerlifting federations that had different ideas, primarily centered on drug testing and drug use. Today, there are literally dozens upon dozens of powerlifting federations in the United States. But I think if you look back over the history of powerlifting in the United States, there's only been one that's been 100% consistent in all of its drug testing philosophy and 100% consistent in performing drug testing at all levels of competition, and that is USA Powerlifting. I think that's something to be very proud of as an organization. The system's not perfect, meaning the drug testing system. It's never going to be perfect. It would be foolish for us to think that there are no people using drugs in USA Powerlifting. Certainly there are. We know this because we catch them, but we don't catch all of them.
So on that note, so we test at 10%. We test 10% of the lifters at every competition. Is that something that you think we should? I mean, is that number correct? Is that where we should remain, or is there an alternative in your mind?
I'm not, for all the history that I've tried to look into, I'm not sure the origin of the 10%. And my guess is it was not 10% at the very beginning with Brother Bennett. I'm not sure where the 10% came into play. So number one, at a minimum, it serves as a deterrent when there's a 1 in 10 chance that they're going to drug test you. I think that deterrent is a pretty powerful deterrent. Certainly we catch people. There's no doubt about it. I'm not sure. I think we'd really have to look at resources, and the resources primarily coming in the form of cost. Obviously, drug tests aren't free. There's a lot that goes into performing a drug test. I'm not sure if we could sustain, greater than 10%. I will say with 100% certainty, I don't think we should ever drop below 10% as our general number across the board. Of course, we do different levels of drug tests depending on the level of the meet, but I think 10% should be the minimum. I don't think we should ever drop below 10%. I do think it's enough to serve as a deterrent. Again, we're not going to catch everybody, and I don't think any system is going to be able to catch everybody, but I do think 10% is probably a good number. I think it's worked well for us in the past, but I'd always be open to alternatives, but I do think that's worked well for us.
Cool. All right.
So
what do you, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to finish up some thoughts. I've kind of always, as a state chair and as a referee, I estimate I've performed 300 to 400 drug tests in meet and out of meet. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that the users are always going to be one step ahead of the people trying to catch them. I think that's just the nature of this kind of process, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to catch them. And I always admired President Maley's messaging when it came to drug testing, and that was, we're going to try to catch you. We don't advertise as being random drug testing. Some people, get that message from somewhere, but it doesn't come from our leadership. If we think you're using drugs, we're going to test you. If you hang out with people who are known to use drugs, we're going to test you. So I do believe that's a powerful message, and I certainly support that. And President Maley was always very unwavering in that. I think, if you look at the landscape today, performance enhancing drugs are a lot more common in sports overall than they were in 1981, and I think they're a lot more common than most people even realize. I think part of the problem is that performance-enhancing drugs, whether they're technically legal or illegal according to a federation or the law, I think they become a lot more accepted in society. And this acceptance, I think, bleeds into competitive sports. And I really think it's problematic, in today's day and age where a lot of people don't even bother hiding it anymore. It would have been something that years ago, nobody would have ever gone on camera admitting to something like that. But now we do see them. I do think that's a problem. I think there's always been a need for a powerlifting organization that truly promotes a drug-free mission. And I think there will always be that segment of the powerlifting population that seeks out that truly drug-free platform. I think we can't really have a conversation about, drug testing and powerlifting and USA Powerlifting without talking about our split from the IPF in November 2021. I mean, you could certainly go and read online, find the details of what all was going on in the background there, but it largely centered on the issue of drug testing. And if we were to stay in the IPF, we would have had to do a lot less drug testing. We would have had to abandon our 10%, minimum testing rate. We would have had to relinquish control of our testing system. And I think, one of the criticisms when this was happening, and I don't remember exactly who it was, but I think it was a relatively famous person who has a podcast in powerlifting, not from the US. And one of the things that this person brought up at the time was not having third-party drug testing is a major problem. And at the time and still today, that's a totally valid criticism. I can't really disagree with that. And one of the things this person said was, well, if it was so-and-so country that's known for maybe having a history of drug use, we would have been screaming to anybody who would listen about something like that and them, being allowed to test themselves. But I think in the interest of us really, maintaining our core principle and our founding mission, we had to keep doing it the way that we do it. And it's not perfect. And again, it is a totally valid criticism that we don't have third-party drug testing at all levels. It would be impossible, financially for us to pay for that if we were to maintain the 10% testing rate. So I certainly don't dispute that criticism. But I do think the system works, and you can certainly accuse me of being biased because I'm a part of that system. But I don't see a long trail of evidence that would, lead somebody to believe that the system is flawed or that there's a lot of bias going on, or things like that. The split was definitely painful with the IPF. A lot of longtime personal friendships were lost. We lost members, and we lost a path to legitimate international competition. That's some pretty significant collateral damage. But we didn't lose our way as it relates to our core principles as an organization and our founding mission. And I think that's what our brand represents. And I believe that Brother Bennett's philosophy very much still has a place in today's powerlifting world.
Cool. All right. Let's see. Question number 3. What do you see as the biggest challenges facing USA Powerlifting today, and how would you address them if elected?
So I think it's hard to argue that the single biggest challenge today is an existential threat to USA Powerlifting, and that is the current and ongoing Minnesota lawsuit. I don't think there's any argument about that. In terms of how to address it, I mean, at this point, the wheels are in motion. The legal process is unfolding. We're several years into it. We probably have several more years to go. So, I think the way we address it in the way the next president address it, because this will fall directly in the lap of the next president to manage almost for sure, is we have to be patient. We have to let the legal process play out. And I think we have to hold our ground. So that, I believe, is the single biggest threat, but that's, at this point, largely out of our control and in the control of the courts. So we have to see how that plays out, but that could be significant if it weren't to go our way. There's no secret to any of that. I think, in the broader sense, there are some warning lights that are flashing that indicate this unprecedented growth that we've seen over the past 15 years is starting to slow. That could be a couple factors. I think some of it is probably related to things that are specific to USA Powerlifting. We certainly have increased competition from other federations in the United States. The split from the IPF caused some collateral damage to us. But I think there's probably some bigger factors as well that drive interest in strength sports like powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, and CrossFit. There were certainly, several factors that kind of coalesced and came together at about the same time, maybe 15 or so years ago, that really resulted in the explosion of interest in things like CrossFit, Olympic weightlifting, and powerlifting. And the question is some of that starting to wane, and things tend to ebb and flow, and is there a little bit of a slowing down of that? I think that's certainly possible. I think listening to President Maley over the years at the National Governing Board meeting, I mean, he mentioned it more than once. We likely cannot continue on this unbelievable trajectory year after year. At some point, things are going to slow down. We might, start to dip in membership. It's just we weren't going to be obviously able to continue on that trajectory forever. But how to address it? I think in the near future we need to potentially plan for membership drop. I mean, I think that's what the data is indicating, at least in the short term over the past couple of years. We knew that it wouldn't continue, as it had been going the past 15 years. And, how to address it is I think we need to right size our infrastructure to match the demands. I mean, forever and ever, and this was, as a state chair and in other, leadership roles over this time of this meteoric growth, it was always us playing catch up, trying to catch up with these jumps in membership, increasing by leaps and bounds. And certainly, Josh, you probably, bore the brunt of that at the 2016 Raw Nationals that you ran in Georgia. I was one of your technical secretaries along with Angela Simons, and we saw, the massive turnout for that event. It started the year before in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and continued in Atlanta. And it was a real struggle. I think, you would agree, as the meet director, having to coordinate that, and certainly as technical secretaries and 5 platforms and multiple sessions and, well over 1,000 lifters. So we were always playing catch up. And now that, we're probably, at a place in terms of our infrastructure to be able to deal with 30,000, 35,000 members, if we start seeing a little bit of a pulling back of that membership, we probably need to right size our infrastructure to match those demands. So I think that is one of the challenges that we face in the coming years. And then finally, we definitely lost something when we lost that path to legitimate international competition with the split with the IPF. How do we deal with that? Do we mend fences with the IPF? I mean, I'm always a possibility thinker. I try not to, I try never to say never. So I don't think we should rule anything out, but I do think we are so far apart with the IPF that any possibility of some kind of reconciliation seems extremely unlikely in the near future, at least. And in my opinion, if that were to even be entertained, they would have to make a lot of concessions, and I don't think they'd ever be willing to make those concessions. So, I mean, I truly believe that the future of international competition, and I believe there is a future for us as a pathway in USA Powerlifting, is the fledgling IDFPA, International Drug-Free Powerlifting Association, that really launched this year. I think there is a ton of potential with the IDFPA. I'm in no way involved with the IDFPA. I mean, it has its own leadership structure. Essentially, my only involvement thus far is they wanted me to create the rule book for them, and I didn't just start from scratch writing a new rule book. Their rule book is essentially our rule book adopted to international competition. That's really been the extent of my involvement with the IDFPA. But I do think that crucial, to its success long term is good leadership and sufficient support, and some of that support will probably need to come from USA Powerlifting. So I think those are some of the major issues or the challenges that we face in the next few years and potential ways to address them.
Awesome. All right. Let's see. Moving right along. Number 4. How do you plan to grow the sport and improve the experience for both new and veteran lifters, basically from the local level all the way through international?
So I think we need to determine the way the larger winds are blowing, and I'll use CrossFit as an example, if you, and I'm not a CrossFit person, and I have nothing against CrossFit. I've never done CrossFit. I'm aware of the general principles. I have friends that own CrossFit gyms. Um, um, it it's not, really a matter of agree, disagree. It's just I stating that I'm not a CrossFit person. But if you look at CrossFit, it's really two components. You have CrossFit, the sport, which involves people doing competitions, the ultimate being the CrossFit Games. And then you have CrossFit, the exercise philosophy, which is people going to their CrossFit classes and basically applying the CrossFit methodology to their exercise and their training. And they probably have no desire to ever do a competition. So, and that just kind of, simple explanation of CrossFit was relayed to me by people that are in the world of CrossFit. Um, Powerlifting is obviously different from CrossFit in a lot of ways, but there likely is a large segment of the population who, the general population, who has heard the increasingly clear message from the healthcare community, the medical fields, that being strong, having sufficient muscle mass is crucial for long-term health, physical function, and longevity. So I think training the power lifts and their variants or the accessory lifts very much support the development of strength and muscle mass. Nobody really disputes that. So, obviously we have powerlifting, the sport, and that's, what our organization is largely based on. But is there a role in the future for, really applying the principles of power lifts to more physical health, functioning, mental health, and not necessarily I want to do a competition, but I want to apply these principles. Obviously, we want them to get into competitions because then they buy a membership and they join USA Powerlifting. But I think that's something to think about because in my field of exercise physiology, that's what I teach. My PhD is in kinesiology with an emphasis in exercise physiology. So this is what I'm really immersed in every day. And it's been interesting to see, and I certainly haven't lived the 100+ year history of exercise physiology, but if you go back, many, many decades up to relatively recently, when people would talk about, what's the most valuable thing for health and fitness and longevity and disease prevention, it was always the cardiovascular stuff, the aerobic stuff. And I'm in no way minimizing that. I mean, I believe that's truly important. But what really was absent for decades and decades was a conversation about the importance of strength training and muscle mass and being strong. And you've seen a pretty significant change in the messaging coming from the medical and the healthcare community in probably the past 10 to 20 years. And they're not saying stop doing the aerobic cardio endurance stuff that we've been telling you to do, but this idea of maintaining muscle mass or increasing muscle mass into adulthood and into later adulthood is actually really, really important for you in terms of physical functioning, activities of daily living, longevity. So I think there's a role for something like powerlifting and certainly an organization like USA Powerlifting, as I think the population starts to get this message that, hey, strength training is important. So I think, how do we grow the sport? How do we grow our organization? I think we continue to do what we've been doing, which is, offering competitions as far and as wide as possible. I think one of the big strengths that USA Powerlifting has always had has been our reach. You go back, years ago and you look across the United States and the various federations, and a lot of them were more regional or kind of territorial. And in this region of the country, this federation was really active and had a lot going on. In this other region, there's a different federation. I think something that USA Powerlifting has always had that most other federations didn't was really, essentially a nationwide presence. Obviously, we've had states that haven't had, as many members as others, and it's not been uniform across the country, but I think we've always had a really wide reach, and I think we need to continue to focus on having that wide reach because, as a larger organization, we do have an infrastructure that can support that, and I think that's where a lot of the other organizations, they simply can't support it outside of maybe a more regional kind of sense. I think you're registering, gyms and training centers, as like, USA Powerlifting, friendly gyms and training centers. I think that creates more powerlifting friendly spaces. And anybody who's a power lifter knows what it's like, going into a big commercial gym and attempting to do your power lifts. it's often a problem, and it's not typically a supportive environment. So I think, we get the message out, we get our brand out by getting gyms on board, training centers on board. And finally, we continue educating coaches. Certainly, Josh, you are acutely aware of that, and that's been a big, part of your role in the organization for many years, educating coaches, trainers on the correct techniques and programming. And something that's really important to me is we do the little things extremely well, meaning it's what we need to do. We need to do the little things extremely well and continue to perpetuate the USA Powerlifting brand. I'll give you an example. I've run maybe 20 or so meets, ran them or was a co-meet director, ranging from local to state to regional meets. But the one that was closest to the heart is the one that I created in 2009. That was the first year I was the Minnesota State Chair. And so I created a meet called Twin Ports Raw Open. I live in Duluth, Minnesota, northern Minnesota, Duluth, Minnesota, Superior, Wisconsin, known as the Twin Ports. I call it the Twin Ports Raw Open. It started as, the first year we had 47 lifters in 2009. I held it in a small local gym that it's a CrossFit gym now. I'm not sure if it was a CrossFit gym back then. It was small. It was tight. Duluth is not typically known as a warm place, but it was extremely warm that day. There was no air conditioning. And a funny story, setting up the platform the night before, come to find out that the floor was not flat. And so as we were setting up the platform, this is my very first meet, never ran a meet before. The floor was slanted enough where the bar would roll right off the front of the floor. So my friend and I stayed up into the wee hours of the night, kind of putting things underneath the front of the platform to make it level, and it worked. But that's where it all started. And there were lots of things.
What a stupid problem to have, right?
And I'd been,
how do you account for that?
I'd been in
that.
The gym's opened by one of my good friends. I went to school with him, and I'd been there many times before, but it's not something you really notice. I mean, it's not like it's a major slant where all of a sudden you feel like you're running uphill. But as soon as you lay down that plywood and put a bar on it, it was rolling off the front, and certainly you couldn't have that. So we just, stuck a bunch of things underneath the front of the platform to level it off, and it worked, but certainly not something I anticipated. And that was the beginning of the 10-year run of Twin Ports Raw Open. So it started with 47 lifters. The next year I work at a college. My office is actually in the athletic facility. So the field house is right down the hall from my office. And I got a good rate being an employee here. So I moved it to the college the next year, and that's where it stayed. And by the last year, which was 2018, I had 100 spots. It was a 2-platform meet by that point in time, 100 spots. And when registration opened, it filled in under 7 minutes. And Duluth is not in the Twin Cities. That's the center of our population and our powerlifting population. We're 2.5 hours away from there. So it's not like I'm in a big metropolis. But what I did over those years is I really tried to build a brand and a reputation around that meet. And I really try to pay attention to everything, every little detail. And I think people recognize that. I never had the resources to have the figurative pyrotechnics and all the incredible things that some meet directors are doing today. And that stuff is great. That stuff is incredible. I didn't have access to that. I had to stick with, kind of the basic stuff. But I found that what people really enjoyed and kept them coming back was the little details were paid attention to. People were responded to when they had a question, and they contacted me via email. The meet itself, it's never perfect as a meet director. You always, the next day, think of all the things that maybe you could have done better, and you recognize a lot of the things that most people don't recognize. But little things, and to me, presentation is very important. And those were the days when the light systems were not the ones we have today, but they were the old boxes with the physical lights and red and white, and the cords that were everywhere, big thick cords. And it was important to me that these things look neat and they're kind of taped down in a nice, neat way. And my friend, who he was my back spotter for all 10 years of my meet. He's not a power lifter. He's a former professional hockey player, really big guy, but he was with me in everything I did. And he helped me with the setup every year. And by the time we got to the later years, he just said, I'm not even going to bother taping these things down because I know what you're going to do. After everybody leaves, you're going to go untape them and then retape them down so they look nice and straight and nice and neat. And I think little details like that presentation, I think it matters. So I think we need to pay attention to the little things. We need to do the little things extremely well, and that's completely within our power to do the little things well. And I think that's what lifters recognize, and I think that's part of our brand. I think when people think about USA Powerlifting, for the most part, they know what they're going to get in terms of the competition, the way it's run. And of course, there's going to be, some variation across 500 plus meets every year, but I do think that's a part of our brand and our reputation. And I mean, you look at like Coca-Cola and McDonald's, and you think about, a Coke or a Big Mac, and you know what you're going to get, whether you're in New York or Los Angeles, it's going to taste the same way. So I think, that's important, that consistency there. Of course, allowing meet directors to sprinkle in their own unique contributions to the meet. And I've always seen us as a customer service oriented organization. I believe that is our focus. I know I've talked to other people, some of whom are in leadership, and there's some debate about, are we really customer service or are we something else? I've always seen us as customer service. We're trying to sell a product, which is powerlifting and our competitions. And if they don't have a good experience, they can easily go somewhere else. We're not the only game in town. We never were, but especially in this day and age, they've got several other organizations to choose from, probably locally. So I do believe we need to, look at things through a customer service type of lens. And, I think, part of what goes into that is, can we eliminate unnecessary barriers or unnecessary frustration? And I think most people watching this would be aware that in January, we significantly relaxed our logo rules. They were very, very specific about what kind of logos you could have on singlets, et cetera. And then people found out at some point thereafter that we made a major revision to those logo rules. And that was my proposal. I had proposed that. The EC had a meeting in early January. That was one of the things I proposed. I had proposed it more than once over the years, and it had never been approved. And so I just continued throwing it out there. And this time something was apparently different. But I believe that eliminated an unnecessary frustration to a lot of lifters. I mean, certainly we need to have some guardrails on what you can have on a singlet or a shirt or something like that. And those are now listed, but it's a very short list of things. And, why do I care if a lifter is going to come and compete wearing a Mountain Dew shirt? Why do I care about that? That wouldn't have been allowed by the previous logo rule. So part of the way I look at things is, does this make sense? Why do we have it? And just keeping it because we've always had it isn't necessarily the answer to the question. So I think, that goes a long way in terms of the customer service piece. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, on the international side of things, I think we, the organization, support the IDFPA to the degree that we're able. I mean, because your question started out with, everywhere from the state, local, up to the international level. And obviously, USA Powerlifting itself is not an international organization per se. I understand we have, an international reach in some different countries, but we are not by definition, an international powerlifting federation. But the IDFPA is, and I think obviously their mission is in lockstep with our mission, and I think we support them as much as we're able to.
Yeah, cool. All right, so shifting gears, sort of, kind of along the same lines. USA Powerlifting's faced various controversies, challenges, and policy changes over the years. As president, how would you address those items?
So I think
kind of an open-ended question, just whatever comes to mind.
Yeah, I think it's impossible to concisely answer the question. There's just, too many different directions we could go, but I'm a huge proponent of risk reduction. I think knowing where our liabilities are, legal and otherwise, where are our vulnerabilities. I think we really have to understand and appreciate we are a huge target. Whether it's somebody, thinking that we've got really deep pockets, or our competitors in the powerlifting world, we're a huge target. And we need to do our best to identify where's the risk, where's the liability, where are the vulnerabilities? And some of that is in reflecting on the past and things that have happened in the past and not repeating those mistakes. But that's a huge part of what I try to always be, the lens I try to look through is the radar's always going in terms of what are the risks. I think, as an organization, some of our problems, and it's unfortunate, but are self-inflicted. I think, one of the themes that's come up probably over many, many years, but certainly in the recent past couple of years, is transparency between the leadership and the larger membership. So I don't disagree with that. I think better communication is needed, better communication between leadership and membership that's already been covered. But I think also, some things that the general members don't see, better communication between the various committees and leadership. And I think sometimes things get, lost in the shuffle. And I think that's where some problems have come from in the past. So trying to improve those communication channels, not only between the leadership and the membership, but also within the structure of the organization, meaning the committees and the leadership. I think if we make a mistake, we meaning collectively the leadership, we meaning, the future president, whatever else, we make a mistake, we need to own it. We need to admit that mistake and then quickly work to correct it. I have no problem admitting when I've made a mistake. I've made plenty of mistakes in the past, and I will make mistakes in the future. But I don't have a problem admitting that I've made the mistake and then try to correct it as quickly as possible. I think, we need to avoid making existing problems worse and dumping fuel on the fire. I think there have been some cases where we've been guilty of that. And as I mentioned before, learning from our mistakes, whether they're, things in the recent past or in the distant past. That's why I think institutional memory among the leadership, like people that have lived the history and remember, the thing that happened 10 years ago with that meet director in that situation or whatever else. Because again, it's not just written down somewhere for the incoming president to come and consult. A lot of it is in the lived experience of the sport and the organization. And I think finally, we need to know when to pull the plug on an idea. If something's not working, I mean, certainly we've put out, over the past 5 or 10 years, new initiatives. We've tried new things. Josh, you'll always be famous for pioneering the prime time idea. And I think we need to analyze those things consistently and determine if something's not working to maybe move on to the next thing instead of just tenaciously holding on to this thing when the evidence suggests that it's not doing what we want it to do. And I think sometimes when things are created and rolled out, they're very successful because the dynamics at the time are different. And then something about the dynamics change years down the road. And now that it is no longer as successful. So I think we need to know when to say when and when it's time to maybe move on to something else. So that's a relatively short answer to your question. So I tried to speak in relatively broad language on that one.
So it sounds like you're saying prime time needs to go away. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that.
Just making sure.
Mm-hmm.
Just making sure this interview's over.
Yeah, I know.
Just kidding. All right, cool. So if you are elected in June as the next USA Powerlifting president, what would you say success would look like? What would make it a successful first term for you? What would be some key accomplishments and stuff that you hope to achieve?
So I think creating a strategic plan for the organization and elements of that strategic plan, I think would be refining our organizational structure, not necessarily redoing everything. I'm not in any way suggesting that, but I think really taking a look at the structure of the organization and identifying what seems to be working really well, what's not working, why, and then, adapt and if necessary, change. I think a defined and, along those lines of the organizational structure, but having a defined and publicly accessible organizational chart. I think if you ask people in leadership to describe our org chart, they could probably do it. They could probably go up to a whiteboard and kind of connect all the dots there. But I think really having that clearly identified and connecting everything together in a way that clearly, depicts how the organization is structured, and the org chart would be the way to go about doing that. So I do think we need one of those in writing. I think, obviously opportunities for increased revenue. I do have some ideas on this, but given that, this interview is going to be essentially accessible to anybody with internet connection at some point in time, I don't want to share my specific ideas here. But I will share them at the NGB meeting as it relates to maybe some potential opportunities to increasing our revenue. And then finally, of course, membership growth, membership retention. If we are in fact in a decline in membership, and it will probably take, another year or two to bear that out if it's a trend or if it's an anomaly. If we are in fact trending downward, at a minimum, stabilizing that at some point, of course, if possible, increasing, membership from the current level. But I think really asking the question, when lifters have so many different options in terms of where they can compete in terms of federation, why should they choose us? I mean, that's an important question that we need to be able to answer. Moving on from, I think those would be the major elements of what I would call the strategic plan. But moving on from that, I think we absolutely have to have a viable path to legitimate international competition. That's obviously been a theme thus far throughout this interview, but we lost a huge thing when we lost that pathway to legitimate international competition. And I'm never one that was ever going to be on an international team. I was never that caliber of lifting. I love lifting as much as anybody else. It's a part of who I am. It will be a part of who I am, hopefully till the day I die. But I was never going to be going to a world championship in anything. But there were, a segment of our membership that was, an option for them. And I mean, overnight we lost that. And I think that is something that we really need to get back up and running again as quickly as possible. But obviously there's some larger factors in play with something like that. I mean, we're certainly, now, well into the age of social media. And I think we really need to fully exploit and harness the power of social media. I know we've had several efforts in that area with probably varying degrees of success, but I don't know that we've fully maximized our potential in that area. And I think in order to do so, that means, I mean, we need to hire people who are really experts in the area. Like, that's what they do. That is their expertise. I don't think we can just continue relying on our members that do have some of that expertise, and they'll do it for a bargain price. I think we need to, go to the experts, and I think that could pay off enormously in terms of membership and future dividends. I mean, that's the world today. A lot of it is social media, and that's where people go for their information. And we really need to maximize that. I think if at all possible, we need to really consistently attempt to have a state chair in every single state. I don't know the last time we had a state chair in every state, and I know it's easier said than done. We have some pretty sparsely populated states, and it does take somebody, willing to put in the effort to be a state chair for a state. So I know it's just not as easy as just naming somebody and putting them in that position. But ideally, again, I do think we have the national reach to be able to have a state chair in every single state and to be able to host at least one competition every year. I think I'm truly a believer in the bylaws being the ultimate governing document of our organization. Obviously, those of you that know me and know what I do on the technical committee, rules matter to me. Rules are extremely important to me. And the bylaws, though not the technical rule book, are singly probably the most important set of rules in the organization. And over the years, through, as a result of various events, they've fallen into disrepair a little bit. I'm not the first person to note something like this, but I do think kind of that ultimate, guiding document needs to be, totally up to date, cleaned up. I don't think an overhaul is necessary like what we did with the rule book, but I do think that's really, really important. And the bylaws to me are of the the highest importance in terms of how we run the organization. And then lastly, I'm a big believer in terms of financially having a healthy reserve in our, proverbial rainy day fund. Um, like I said, we're always going to be a target because of our visibility and our size, and something like a lawsuit could be totally out of our control. We did nothing wrong, but now we're fighting that lawsuit, and those things are expensive. So I think having a healthy reserve, and I don't know what that healthy reserve is, and I certainly don't want to share numbers publicly in this interview here, but that's a major area of importance to me, is to have that healthy reserve to be a buffer, in the event that we find ourselves in a situation, needing it. So that would probably round out the things that would be, kind of front of my mind in the first 3 years.
Okay. Awesome. So you've mentioned the IDFPA a few times here. So here's a hypothetical for you. Let's say that you are competing at the IDFPA Worlds. You're in third place, and your third deadlift is to move into first. What music are you listening to?
Let me tell you a funny story before I answer that question about music. So anybody from the 1990s that watched Saturday Night Live would be aware of Hadaway and What Is Love, right? You know that song. And so I I would always come into my classroom and say, just once I want to walk into class to that song playing. And it was always like a joke. And then one day, this is my graduate class, um, they took it upon themselves to rent a smoke machine, rent a bunch of flashing lights, and time it so that when I walked into the classroom, all of that was going with Hadaway's "What Is Love" playing in the background, and it sounds funny until you realize that it set off all the smoke alarms in the building, and we're in a really big building with a lot of people, and all the smoke alarms are going off. The whole building is emptying, um, and and I'm left to explain this to somebody. So as much as I was entertained and um, honored by what they did, I guess. A lot of apology letters were written to a lot of people after that. So as you know, Josh, I'm a product of the 1980s. I was born in 1976. I really, grew up in the 1980s. I know you're not quite a 1980s person, but you're an adopted 1980s person. Is that accurate?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I definitely grew up with Aerosmith was one of my probably favorite groups in high school. My earliest days in strength training in high school, it was a small um, Catholic high school. The weight room was a dingy little sub basement. You can kind of get the picture there, but that was my first exposure to strength training. And I remember it was always, Metallica was always playing, and that's almost a cliche in the sport of powerlifting. So probably something between those two, that I don't know. I can give a specific song, and yeah.
What if I ask you for a specific song? What would you say?
Hmm.
I got to ask because, this podcast has a music component to it. So something has to be music related in it. So
Well, I mean, one of their most famous songs, and certainly, one of the ones that I probably like the most is "Dream On." So we'll go with Aerosmith's "Dream On."
all right, for your third attempt deadlift.
Yeah, but remember, I'm not an international caliber lifter, so I'm probably not going to be lifting the IDFPA. So this has got to be a local meet that this is happening
Regardless,
at.
you're pulling for the win.
Okay.
Aerosmith "Dream On" is the song.
Yeah.
Awesome. I love it. I
Yeah.
love it.
Okay. Good.
I approve.
Okay.
So cool. All right. So getting back on topic here. So I guess in your own words, if some of the voting members are on the fence, not sure who to vote for, why should they vote for Joe Warpeha? I guess make your closing arguments as you will to the membership and the voting members. Why Joe Warpeha?
Here's what I would say. I would say if you're looking for somebody that's going to dramatically change USA Powerlifting from the way it's been, I am not your candidate. I will tell you 100% straight out, do not vote for me. I do not have plans to redo everything and you know start from scratch by doing everything differently. I think there are definitely some things that we can improve on, but for the most part, I mean, look at the success we've had. I mean, in a relatively short period of time, 15 years or so, we went from you know annual memberships of 3, 4, 5,000 to 30 plus thousand. So to suggest like that wasn't very successful and that wasn't working, I don't feel a need to reinvent the wheel. Like I said, I will certainly probably do some things differently than the current or previous leadership. But what I would say is, and obviously this is a historic election. President Maley has been the president for 22 years. That's by far the longest tenure of any president in USA powerlifting. The vast, vast majority of members have never known another president. And while I would, I can certainly sit there and, Monday morning quarterback some of the decisions that he made, and maybe say I would do it differently in terms of the really big, important philosophical issues. I don't think I've ever differed from him, in terms of the decisions that he made. So, like I said, if you're looking for somebody to do things dramatically different, I'm not your person. Um, I would say this. I would say you need to take this election very seriously. I don't, the names haven't been released of everybody who has been nominated. My understanding was that it was 5 different people, but I think that years down the road, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, is 5 different to very different looking organizations based on who the president is. So take it very seriously. To the voting members of the National Governing Board, your vote's very important. This isn't an election that's going to have 100,000 votes cast. It's going to be 50, 60, 70 votes. Your vote makes a difference. And really, truly analyze each candidate. Look at their letter of intent. Look at their bio. Contact them. Ask them questions. Many of you as voting members represent constituencies, state chairs, committee chairs. Talk to your constituencies, see what they think. And if you can't be at the National Governing Board meeting, which sometimes you can't, you can't be there, there's a mechanism to proxy your vote. Therefore, your vote still counts. So regardless of it's me or if it's somebody else, I do encourage you to take it seriously. This is truly a historic election, and look at it from every angle you possibly can, whether it's these interviews, the speeches that will be given at the National Governing Board meeting on the day of the vote. I will say for my part, I hope you would reach out to me personally with questions. And in my letter of intent, I give you my work email address, which is the best way to contact me. And I would love to
What is
talk to you.
if people can contact you, what is the best way for them to contact you if you want to mention it here?
The email address?
Yeah.
So it's J and then my last name, WARPEHA at C as in cat, CSS.edu. So 1C, College of St. Scholastica, CSS.edu. That's the best way to contact me. And I'm happy to chat over the phone, via Zoom. Most of you probably wouldn't be able to do an in-person meeting, but really I can do anything you want to do. I'm happy to talk. I will be honest with you. I'll answer your questions. If I don't know the answer, I'll say I don't know the answer. But please take it seriously. Every vote counts, and this is an important one. So I think in closing, I believe my time in the organization represents several different leadership positions. I think I've done about every role in the organization there is, probably not every single one, but when it comes to running a meet, every role in a meet, I think I've seen it from the side of the grassroots side of things. Having started as a lifter, having been a state chair, watching a state grow significantly to the various levels of leadership up to the executive committee, which is where the really sensitive stuff gets handled. A lot of it can't be shared for obvious reasons, but I think that's what I bring with me. And like I said, the first time I started thinking about this was in 2015, 10 years ago. And ever since then, I would sit at the NGB meetings and I would listen to President Maley, give his speech, and I would listen very carefully to every word he said. And I would often ask myself, what if it was me standing up there? What would I say? Would I say the same thing? Would I make the same decision? So I guess my last thought is, for me, a lot of thought has gone into this. I take it very seriously. It's a big commitment. I'm fully prepared to make that commitment. My day job gives me a phenomenal amount of flexibility in terms of a lot of vacation time, in total over 5 months every year of vacation time. And my day-to-day schedule is very, very flexible. So I would not be running for this position if I could not commit fully to it in terms of the work that will be involved. So I guess that's probably where I would end it.
All right. Well, that's all I have. That's all the questions. Any follow-up or questions or compliments you would like to give me?
Compliments. It's a long list. We don't have time here, Josh.
I'm just kidding. No, but no, it was great talking with you. I do appreciate everything, and I definitely appreciate all the service that you've given to USA Powerlifting over the years and continue to give. And best of luck at the election in June.
Thank you, Josh, and thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode of the Powerlifting and Power Ballads podcast, please remember to subscribe and share it with your friends.